Chapter 5. Enemy of the People. When at last, with chest heaving and legs about to give out, Ari reached the town and continued running at a slower pace through its deserted streets, uncertainty overwhelmed him once more. What if the police were watching this railway station after all? He'd heard the call on the radio for a general alarm nationwide and wasn't sure what that meant. When the manhunt failed to pick up his trail to the south, wouldn't they suspect he'd doubled back? Of course, they wouldn't expect him to head for Berlin. The infamous wall made that city the least likely place for a possible escape to the west. However, there was no predicting where the police might be or what they might do, precisely because they couldn't be certain of his movements. More than likely, they'd be watching all routes. One thing was certain: he must not even think of leaving East Germany. In 1956, the Hungarians had relied on brave promises of support from the West, only to find themselves abandoned in their pitiful attempt to stand up to Soviet tanks. Nor would there be help from the West this time. If that shameful wall was ever to be brought down, and with it the entire Iron Curtain, it would have to be done from inside. Grandiose dream? Perhaps. Yet seemingly impossible aspirations had always been and would always be the propellant fueling every great advance in human history. He had talked with hundreds of people, enough to be confident that at least 95% of the university students and workers in Eastern Europe had the same passion to throw off their shackles. They only awaited effective leadership and the right opportunity. He would lie low for a while, disappear. They would eventually believe that he had escaped to the West. Then he would start again. He had a genius for organizing students, and he had painstakingly nurtured a network of key contacts throughout Eastern Europe, reaching even into the Soviet Union. Those names and addresses were the secret weapon he carried in the briefcase, a weapon for freedom that he was convinced would prove in the end to be more powerful than the most sophisticated military hardware. There would, unavoidably, be a cost in lives, but oppressive regimes would eventually collapse if only enough people stood against them. It was a dream worth living or dying for. Legs trembling with fatigue, Ari paused to recover his breath in the shadows just around the corner of a tobacco shop that faced the train station. A look at his watch told him that he'd barely made it. He couldn't see into every part of the waiting room, but it appeared to be empty. 2 women stood on the open platform. There was no sign of police. He glanced anxiously at his watch again and waited. The approaching train could just be heard in the distance when a small car drove up and slid to a halt in the tiny station parking lot. A well-dressed man of about 40 jumped out. Carrying an expensive briefcase, he ran into the waiting room, bought a ticket, and hurried onto the platform, to all appearances a legitimate traveler, and all the more convincing because he was alone. The train pulled into the station, steel screaming against steel as the brakes were applied. Still, there was no sign of the police. 1 minute went by. The 2 women on the platform boarded. An elderly and poorly dressed woman he hadn't seen exited the waiting room and boarded wearily. 2 minutes. Another woman of about 50, bent under a heavy load wrapped in a huge cloth, shuffled past him and onto the platform, heaved her bundle up, and climbed aboard. Still no sign of police. 3 minutes. Now! Ari heard the sledgehammer blows of his heart as he hurried across the street, hat pulled down and handkerchief pressed to his nose, and walked straight through the waiting room. The lone clerk on duty was dozing and didn't even open his eyes. Running along the platform, he jumped aboard the last car just as the brakeman signaled for the doors to shut and the train pulled away. Ari went immediately into the small WC and locked the door. From his briefcase, he pulled out a kit prepared for just such an emergency. He quickly shaved off his beard and mustache, taking great care not to cut himself. The ugly wound that angled upward just above his right ear was starting to scab over, but still oozed some blood. There was nothing he could do to hide it. He found the small tube of dye that would turn his black hair into a light brown and nervously skimmed the instructions. Unscrewing the lid, he hesitated for a moment, then screwed it back on. What if he botched the job? No, it was too risky. Cotton stuffed into his nose spread his nostrils and changed his voice. Adding a pair of thick glasses, he now resembled, except for the hair color, Heinrich Seibel, the person pictured in the false identification papers that had cost him 1,000 marks. Entering the car, Ari took a seat in the rear, where he could observe everything and make a hasty exit if necessary. The early run into Berlin was emptier than usual. There were only 2 other passengers in his coach. Ari had just taken a magazine from his briefcase and pretended to be absorbed in reading it when the conductor came through to check tickets. "Sorry, I was late and didn't have time to get a Berlin ticket at the station." Ari kept his head averted so that his wound couldn't be seen. "What if I don't have one? You can't count on that," came the ill-tempered response. The conductor stirred angrily around in his bag, muttering about people who made his job unbearable. At last he found a Berlin ticket, punched it, and gave it grudgingly to Ari, took his money, and then complained again under his breath about having to make change. That's what Marxism does, kills incentive. Ari turned his attention again to the magazine as the conductor headed doggedly back up the aisle. At least the grouch gave no indication of having been alerted to watch for a fugitive. Everything seemed normal. Of course, the police could come aboard at any station down the line. What then? Should he rely on his phony papers or try to escape? He'd have to decide that at the time. Somehow he would make it to that haven in Berlin. Fragmented thoughts drifted in and out as Ari fought to stay awake. It was a battle that he no longer had the strength to win. The dull, monotonous hum of the train's engine and the rhythmic clickety-clack of the wheels on the tracks quickly dulled his fear of danger and rocked him to sleep. How long he had been sleeping he didn't know, when he suddenly jerked upright in his seat, heart pounding, awakened by some instinct that signaled danger. Something wasn't right. The train was grinding loudly to a halt, but the feel and sound were different, not like the usual approach to the many stations along the route to Berlin, with which he was so familiar. Looking around, he noticed that he was the only passenger left in his coach. A quick glance out the window revealed, in the first rosy light of dawn, only the desolate reaches of farmland and heath. A highway no more than 50 feet away ran alongside the railroad tracks. What's going on? Now he could see the scarlet glare of emergency flares up ahead. A lone police car had pulled off the highway and was parked near the tracks, the rotating light on its roof flashing amber and red. 2 men in plain clothes stood by the car, waiting as the train screeched to a stop. Stasi! Had they found the car he'd abandoned already? It couldn't be. Instinctively, he made the critical decision. His false ID would probably pass inspection during any routine encounter with ordinary police, but the hated state security forces were far better trained. Under these circumstances, they'd be especially thorough. Better not risk it. Ari jumped from his seat and ran to the back of the car. Opening the exit door away from the highway, he prepared to leap out and make his escape. Unfortunately, as he had already observed through the window on the other side of the train, nothing but newly plowed fields met his gaze. No forest in sight. It was hopeless. They would see him immediately. There was only one thing to do: get back to his seat quickly, pretend to be asleep, and somehow bluff his way through, hoping he wouldn't have to shoot his way out of this one as well. Just then, to his right, he caught sight of an access ladder leading upward. On an impulse, he stepped onto it, leaned out, and silently closed the door. A few more moments and he was lying flat on top of the train, breathing in short, sharp gasps, clutching his briefcase, wondering if he'd made a mistake, and hoping. Had the road and the parked cars been on a level with or above the train, he would have been seen. But luckily, the terrain at this point sloped down to the road, which was about 20 feet lower than the tracks. Footsteps crunched past in the gravel alongside the train. Voices yelled indistinct instructions. The magazine! He'd left it on the seat. The conductor would remember. Ari pulled the Luger from his belt and waited for a head to appear above the top of the train. Minutes passed like hours. Nothing. At last, with a welcome lurch, the train began to move forward. Ari lay still for a few more minutes as it gathered speed. He cautiously raised his head to peer around. The police car was still parked in the same place, and the 2 men were climbing back into it. Breathlessly, he watched as they pulled out onto the highway and headed in the opposite direction. As the car faded into the distance, he slid over to the ladder and made his precarious way back down. The train was nearing full speed when he reached the door, pulled it open with great effort against the wind, and stepped inside. Ari made his way quickly back to his seat and collapsed, trying desperately to control his pounding heart and gasping breath. Then he noticed something that made his heart start pounding again. The magazine was gone. What did that mean? Why hadn't the police looked on top of the train, or at least searched for footprints in the adjoining field? The only footsteps he'd heard had been on the side of the train closest to the road. Something must have convinced them that he'd never been aboard. What luck! After the train made a routine stop at the next station to let off and take on more passengers, the conductor came through once again to check tickets. Ari was still the only one in the last car. "What was that all about?" he asked casually when he showed his ticket again. "Mechanical problems?" "They were looking for some enemy of the people," came the matter-of-fact reply. His expression was wooden, but his eyes, looking into Ari's now, seemed to be saying something. "Some guy about your age and size, with a beard. I told them I hadn't seen anybody even close to their description." "Really?" Ari responded warily. "They were looking for some fugitive?" The conductor held Ari's eye for an uncomfortable moment. "They would have found him if I'd told the truth," he said quietly, "but I hate the Stasi." He reached under his coat and, without changing expression, pulled a familiar magazine from his back pocket and thrust it under Ari's nose. "You left this on the seat." Too stunned to reply, Ari took the magazine. He felt the hair rising on the back of his neck. "Thank you very much," he finally managed to stammer. "Very much." "And next time," grumbled the conductor, "don't be so forgetful. My job's bad enough without having to cover up for people like you." He turned and shuffled back up the aisle toward the front of the train.